A cool November 24th
Yes, it is.
at Bloated Toe Enterprises, once again with our friend Larry Gooley. It's Thanksgiving Eve. That's what Calvin called it
Right.
before we started.
A new holiday.
I don't smell any turkey.
No, you won't hear.
When I left home this morning, my wife was so intimate with that turkey, I was almost jealous. That thing weighed 24 pounds, and she said, "Can you just turn it around for me?" Oh, of course, we have a big family to feed, and my stomach is already growling, and I'm waiting for tomorrow. Larry Gooley, how are you, my friend?
Oh, I'm pretty good. Pretty busy.
You're always very busy.
Oh, yeah.
This is for people who haven't seen our previous interviews, and we've done a couple. Larry Gooley is a mastermind behind enterprises called Bloated Toe.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like I spend 3% of my waking hours explaining to people what the heck Bloated Toe is. Because I'm a fan. Not only are we friends, but I'm a fan of what you do. And thanks to the interviews we've done before, I understand what you go through for 18 or 20 hours every day of your life,
yeah.
trying to make a buck, helping other people, and forgetting sometimes that you got to have a little money coming in the side door to keep doing what you're doing.
Yeah, it's true. You do a lot of free work, but you need to make a living.
So we'll spend just a couple of minutes in the beginning explaining that you and your wife were on a mountainside somewhere hiking, and you got a sore toe and
bug bites.
and so on. And so this idea came to call it Bloated Toe. And there are some who would call that a brilliant move,
Yeah, there are some.
as long as the toe finally healed. But Bloated Toe is something that does capture the attention.
I suppose.
And so now you've turned that into I won't say an empire, because that maybe remains to be seen.
Yeah. No, but it's very busy. The book publishing is very, very busy. Busy doing my own and busy doing for other people.
Now let's, before we get into your newest book, let's just explain to me what Bloated Toe Enterprises does.
Well, the main thing we do is book publishing. I can take someone's idea right from scratch, right through to the printed book ready to sell. And we've done it for a few others. And while I'm doing that, I'm also writing and publishing my own books. So I'm busy every minute of the day. If I don't have something from one of my clients to work with, then I'm working on my own book.
And believe me, even though it's called Bloated Toe Enterprises, there's no way the subtitle could be Slipshod Enterprises, because this is the most meticulous guy I've ever seen in my life for detail. But you wouldn't be happy when you did finally go to bed at night unless you had it right for that day, would you?
Right, yeah, I torture myself with, I think I actually credit a lot of it to St. Mary's, the Catholic school standards. You weren't allowed to misspell things, everything was important, and that shows when you have to work with some professionals. Like I've worked with doctors and scientists, and when you do their work, you better get it right. I also have an online store where we sell all kinds of North Country products. I'll do publishing. I've done some ghostwriting for people who have a manuscript but need it written so that it flows.
Tweaked?
Yeah. Well,
sometimes a little more than tweaked.
Beyond tweaked, yeah.
Yeah. So what titles do you have going right now that you're most proud of?
Well, since we last met about a year ago, in fact, right after you had left, I was contacted by a couple of professors from St. Lawrence County, a pair of botanists who had worked together for over 30 years. And they had seen that I published Oliver's War and Terror in the Adirondacks. And they were interested, so they checked out our website to see what I did about publishing, and got in touch by email to say that they had accumulated their life's work and it was in the hands of the New York State Museum. But it had been there for about 2 years. The museum was going to publish it. But then the economy crashed, and it had already been there 2 years, and they were becoming concerned that some of the science was going to be old before it was ever printed. So, she said, I thought I'd try you out to see what you guys do. So we actually met each other by email, and I told them that if the document is ready to print, as you say it is, then you could be selling it within about 6 weeks. And I said, with all due respect to your...
Famous last words.
Well,
oh,
but
gosh.
with all due respect to your credentials, my experience says there's still probably 1,000 changes to make, even though you said it is now ready and it's waiting to print. So it was respectful back and forth, and I could just tell by communicating with Ann Johnson how nice she was. So we just slowly began the process, and I said, even if there are that many things to correct, I would say in about 3 months we can have books in hand ready to sell. So I met her partner, Nancy Elblum, who's in California. I met her online also, just by email, and we communicated back and forth, and we began the process, and about 3 months later, the book was ready for sale. And this was something different for me because, as I said, from my background at St. Mary's and my background of constantly reading as a child, you know, at least a dozen books a week, your text has to flow. And this is just the opposite of flow, because this takes a certain plant that we would never notice, and it describes everything about it, what family it's in, and you have to use the correct terminology.
Of course.
And that book ended up looking like this. So,
I was so pleased to see this. Not that I'm, by definition, a flower child. Far from it.
well,
But I love flowers and plants, and that's by osmosis because my wife is a wonderful plant lover and flower lover.
well,
So this was a challenge.
yes, and the subtitle becomes important because it's The Plants of St. Lawrence County, an annotated checklist of vascular flora. This is something that I might want.
Try that on David Letterman.
Well, I might want a plant guide that shows me color pictures of all the plants so I can identify them as a layman. But this is for someone that might do that or take it a step higher in the world of science. It identifies the plants. You can picture it in your mind by reading their description. So I actually did have one complaint because they said the cover was so beautiful and bright color that they thought it was full of color pictures. And no, there is a set of...
I saw it.
They wanted to include some photos, so I told them we had to find a way to do it economically. And we ended up doing this. That was all, that center part was all my creation because they did want at least to show some color photos of the plants, of a few of them.
And we should tell our audience that it costs a lot of money to print color.
Oh, yes. I would get an estimate for them and then get an estimate for 12 color pages and 6 color pages, and they were, you know, it's very expensive to do. You have to use, you know, the company has to do a special insert that's not actually part of the text.
So this is different from anything you've ever done.
Oh, yes, and in the back you'll
This is
see.
more a treatise than anything else,
Right.
isn't it?
But they were very happy with it. And you know, the interesting thing for all this, of all this at the end for me was, after the book was published, and I already had it for sale on the website, I hadn't met them yet. So Nancy flew in, we scheduled some book signings in St. Lawrence County. She flew in from California in June, maybe in May or June, and she met with Ann, and then Jill and I drove up to meet them. And you know, that's the first time I'd actually seen them in person, and we exchanged, you know, we had dinner together, and we had a good time visiting. They were as nice as they seemed in the emails, too.
And they're satisfied with the result. How could they not be?
Oh, totally, yes. The difficult thing with this book is, if you write a book, you know, you have to face facts. You have to, if you want to sell it, you have to write something that people will want, that it will sell. And this has a specialized audience. So in this case, instead of partnering with them, I told them this would be the price for what I'm going to do, and then I will help you sell it anyway, which I am doing now. So they've also, because you know one of them's retired, they're making contacts throughout their world and selling books that way. And you know I have a supply here, and they have some, but they're very pleased with it, and I did like the way it came out. I'm always surprised because I did the color combination to match like this, and
I know you
I really
did.
Didn't know.
How it would, and it absolutely turned out perfect.
Well, I left it up to the women to tell me, no, that's terrible or it's good, but they liked it, and you know they're very pleased with it.
Yeah, you have no way of predicting whether this book's going to sell 500 or
Right.
10,000.
Right, and in this case, it's going to be mostly to professionals and to libraries, really, because you know I would use it. I do have a few books like that where I'd always like to know what I'm seeing in the woods, identify the plants. But when you're a layman, pictures help. So.
Some of these plants don't grow in Land Mountain, don't
That's
you know
right.
that?
That's right.
All right, so that was a very interesting project, and I'm sure every time you engage in something like this, it's a huge learning curve for you.
Tremendous. And you know, I know a lot about the plants of St. Lawrence County now just from having to read it repeatedly. And the editing was important to me because these women are both professionals, you know, scientists all their lives. And when Nancy contacted me, I did tell her that from experience, I'll just say I'm going to find a lot of errors. Are you comfortable with me saying this should be changed? Well, and she just let me know that she had been a professional copy editor. So she said, we're going to see what you can do. So I did nice sample pages for her, and I love the email I got back. She said, it's in your hands. So, you know, I knew at least my copy editing was good. I knew that.
Was it more than 1,000 changes?
Oh, yes.
I'm laughing, but it's not funny at all.
No, it was just about 2,000, and they had new content. Anne found some new plans that hadn't been documented, so I said, well, we can add it. So we did, you know, we added it, and we tried to come up with a number of pages. It's economical to do a certain number of pages divisible by 32, so that's what I did. But, you know, they're very pleased with it, and I love the way it looks.
As we roll on here, we're going to talk about a lot of things that you're doing, have done, and plan to do. And primary is the fact that we want people to be able to contact you. So the first thing they should do is get on your website.
Right.
Which is?
The 3Ws, bloatedtoe.com. And from there, it links to my store, to publishing information, to the books that I've published, and also the books that I've written, and lots of other historical information. There's a Line Mountain website. There's a Whitehall website. I might do another one on Churubusco soon. We have some Shazy soccer things on there, too. So there's all kinds, and a lot of, you know, it's all free content. We also list the names that appear in a lot of the books, and there might be thousands of names, so that anybody looking for something within the world.
You've got to be kidding me.
Yeah, with genealogy, like Bob Garrow's book, the baseball book, there's something like 1,400 surnames in there. So if you're searching, and especially if you're new at it, you need to know there were about 6 different spellings of that name, and this person might be in there. So
that's amazing. That's above and beyond the call of duty.
Yeah, well, we did that event once with the Northern New York American Canadian Genealogical Society.
You got it, baby.
Yeah. And we printed out the whole thing to show people what's available. So if you are searching, this might help. Because I know how it is when I'm searching. Every little bit helps.
So it's the website itself is a resource.
Yes.
For information, and it certainly it tells the picture of what you're doing, paints a picture, and it's undergoing changes all the time.
Right. I did have one thing that was sort of becoming special, but it just became too much work. It was a newsletter. A newsletter that
I remember you telling me.
And I was doing historical pieces, but it was so time-consuming, and it just took so much time away from publishing. So we suspended it for a while when I became extra busy. But then I started to initially just post a few stories when I had time on Facebook, and it wasn't planning on going anywhere with that. But I was contacted by someone who runs the top online journal in the Adirondacks, Adirondack Almanac. John Warren runs that. I didn't know who he was, but he just wrote one day and he said, "Larry, these stories are great," and I didn't know it really. You can't tell if anybody's reading them. So he said he wanted to talk to me about something, and I had no idea what it was, but he asked me to write for the Almanac. And, you know, I know there's a lot of very well-educated people on there, newspaper editors, the editor of Adirondack Explorer. I know there's at least one Harvard person on there. So, you know, I thought this would be a good idea if I could manage it, but there's just so little time, because to prepare a historical piece every week is probably going to take you 2 or 3 days. I can't give away 2 or 3 days, but I did start to do, and the trouble is I write stories that are a little bit too long, but I started to do it, and I've stuck with it. And
I'm laughing because I recognize that.
Well, so to squeeze that in with everything else, I told him I would try to do one a week, which I've done for, I'm not sure now, maybe 4 or 5 months. This is just a sample of one. They keep a bio published of me on there. This was a story I did about the Cog Railway, the Whiteface Mountain.
We're talking 800 or 900 words, or what?
Generally, yes, but sometimes I will leak over to about 1,400 words. So I did a few that were 2-parters because I don't like to tell a part of a story. That's the difficulty for me, like newspaper writing, is because, you know, it's easy to make mistakes because you're always in a hurry, and that's forgivable. But when you take the time to do one, you need to get it right. So
people can find that where?
It's called Adirondack Almanac. If they just search that through Google, they'll find it. It's Almanac with a K at the end, but it's They carry all the news across the Adirondacks, but they also have writers for specific categories. Like I do history. John does history himself. There's some that do the nature world, Adirondacks, hiking. There's all kinds of things like that.
Not that we're necessarily promoting any specific search engine, but I've noticed that Google is becoming a lot more user-friendly for idiots like me.
Yeah, personally, I wouldn't advertise for them either. It's just that if I compare to any other, the results are so much better. The problem is some of the things that Google does I don't like.
Yeah.
Like they're trying to actually take your literary content, because they're saying that we're actually helping you by publishing your book on Google because other people will see it
That
and
would
want to
tend to
buy it.
irritate you a little
Yeah,
bit.
so I signed no, absolutely not. Don't touch my content.
Yeah.
Because that's what they want to do with it. I understand that you want to use, but they think it's helping you by selling books, and it isn't. It's just free content.
Only you would know what the bottom line is, Larry, because you're sitting there all the time, right?
Well, you have to really.
All right. Tell me what else you're proud of. What's
All
going
right, so, well, when you guys were here last year, I had just come out with a book called Terror in the Adirondacks.
on? Absolutely.
True story of serial killer Robert F. Garrow. And, I've done several history books, but, how crime sells, well, that turns out to be pretty true. That, from when I last saw you, that book took off, and I explained before that I don't wholesale under the traditional business terms. I offer my books to stores at $5 off retail. So if my book is $22, they buy it for $17, but I'll ship it to them for free, and we'll give them 60 days to pay instead of the standard 30. So, if you're running a store within 60 days, you should be able to sell my books. So it didn't cost you anything, I'll send you more books. So some stores don't want to do that, but with this book here, that became, it was in such demand that stores that had already said, no, we're not going to carry it, started asking me to send it. And one store ended up selling, I think, 300 copies since last year.
Come on.
That's a lot of copies. In fact, one thing I did enjoy, last year we had a little sign here that Calvin filmed. It said I was on the bestseller list
Yes.
in Glens Falls at Red Fox Books. And they became a steady customer. And I thought, I was on it 3 weeks in a row. That was exciting because my name was above like Mark Twain for a minute.
Sure.
That was just funny. Well, amazing to me that 2 weeks ago it was number 2 on the bestseller list in the same place. And that now it's been a whole year. A couple of weeks it wasn't on the list during that time. And it turned out to be largely because they thought, sales are dwindling, so instead of purchasing a dozen, they started to buy 6. And when it was off the list was because they ran out of books. And then when they bought, we're right back at the top of the list. So, it really, this has really gone, it went so well that it sold out. Actually, we just received the shipment. We had to do a reprint, which I told you, financing a reprint is expensive. You can only take an educated guess at how many you're going to sell. And if you overestimate, you've got a lot of doorstops. You're not making any money on those books. They're just going to sit there. So I took a gamble on this. I wasn't really sure how many to print, but it was more than the usual, and it sold out, and I had to do another one right away.
This is a special case and a special book. Those people who were alive during this time period, when was 1970?
73 was when the manhunt took place.
Will remember it vividly, especially people like me who were in the media at the time. But people who are not at all involved with the case are interested because it's exciting.
Oh, it really is.
It's interesting. And you told me, you didn't promise me, but you told me there might be a movie deal involved in this. Now we need an update on that.
Well, we have one. And another trick I had to pull here was I had to change printers. So
you did?
The reprint had to look like the original, and that's actually not that easy to do, but it did come out. It looks virtually exact to me. You can
Well,
flash it over there.
I certainly can tell the difference, yeah. So,
I forgot what it was you asked me.
movies.
Oh, well, we did have the contract for Oliver's War, and because of the economy again, they were having trouble finding funding. So I re-signed with them on that book in June, I think it was. I think I gave them another year. But in the meantime, there's been some interest about Terror in the Adirondacks. And I really don't know what's going to happen or which direction it'll go. But I know that if you could get your book in front of anybody that's important in TV or movies, that's critical. And we did have an order from the president of NBC television.
Ooh.
I didn't.
Ooh.
I didn't know at the time, but a woman called and said she'd been trying to find this book in Lake Placid and can't find it. Lake Placid's bookstores one that wouldn't carry me unless I go under their terms.
Oh.
So I said, well, then I won't let it go. So she couldn't find it, so she called us. And she ordered a couple of copies, so just like that, I have 2 copies in their house. That was important. And there was another person involved in television that's looking at it. So right now, nothing's happening right now, but I need to go forward with everything else. So you just put it in somebody's hands and
Sometimes
wait.
those things go ploddingly slow.
Oh, definitely. A lot of
But
them.
if it happens,
Yeah, right. I'm not looking for it. It's great if it happens, and I agree to help them with any part of the project. But in the meantime, I need to sell books.
but
Okay.
doesn't your mind go wild when you think of this as a movie?
Yeah, it's
And I don't think they'd have to pick you as the main character.
no, God no.
But
But it's just, of all the books I've read, there's so many twists in that. It reads like you really sat down and tried to write the wildest mystery ever. But it's not it's a true story. It's just the twists are just amazing. I mean, I wasn't aware of all the twists either. That's one reason I wrote the book. I wanted to know the story. But the details are there, and you will see people online claiming that, well, I looked at the record and I'm not sure he got it right. Well, I'll guarantee you, I'd stake my life on it, because it comes from the court record, and that is
Yeah.
the official record, and it comes from people that were involved in it.
well, this is the stuff legends are made of. And legends are not always necessarily true to the letter.
Right.
And so I know how hard you work to get this one
Well,
right.
you have to get it right. Otherwise, well, it's nice that I've had a lot of comments that it was easy to read. That's what, again, that St. Mary's background, your writing had to be smooth. So people have told me that's the part, because I didn't make up the story. So of course the story's good. I didn't create that. I wrote the story. But it's nice to hear people say that it was easy to read. And what happens is, one of the most important things for any, especially a small-time author, is if you do that and you sell to someone and they like it, they're going to call their relatives. And word spreads, and that one book is it's just like planting seeds. You will get orders from elsewhere because of it.
This book, you knew in the beginning, you and I both knew, just by looking at it, knowing the story, that this story would take on a whole life of its own.
I
And
hope.
I think the last chapter, the whole thing is yet to be written for you.
Well, the one, it's done several things. First of all, I've got a lot more attention. I started to get requests to go out and speak at different places. And it's very difficult to find the time to do that. But when you start to balance that with how many books you're selling, then you do need to get out there somehow. So I had several requests, and I picked a few, and one was in Old Forge. And there was a store there that used to carry my books, but then they got a new person in handling the buying, and they didn't like the fact that I only gave $5 off. So she said, we will no longer carry any of your books, just like that. It was a very curt message, not very pleasant. But I got an offer from a place just 2 doors down that said, would you like to come and speak, and we'd love to have you.
Stick it to them.
Well, they said,
Yes, I love it.
and then they said, we're going to pay you to come and speak. So
Yes,
I said,
that's
well,
even
all
better.
right, so you're going to pay me to come and speak, and I'm going to sell books right near the place that won't carry my books. So I did go to that event. That was back in June or July, maybe. And you don't know really what you're going to get as far as attendance. I'm not known everywhere. I mainly focus on the Adirondacks, but I'm not well known in Old Forge except for Oliver's War. So it started to look at about 10 minutes of start time. It didn't look like there were that many people there, but I'll tell you, by the time I got started, there were people standing at the door and backed up outside the door.
Don't you love it?
So this
you're
was
going
great.
like this under
Yeah.
the table.
Well, from other authors will tell you they do events like that, and if you see 50 people, you might sell 4 or 5 books if you're lucky when you're done. But this is a pretty good crowd. So I wasn't looking more for sales. It's just that I went past my allotted time for speaking. But
No.
the people in charge came over after and said, well, we see that happen, and people, it's evening and their eyes are drooping and they're all tired, but he said everybody was on the edge of their seats.
Yeah, how could
Because
they not be?
you're talking about murder and about history. So that went very well. I did one not too long ago at Lake Luzerne, and the same thing happened there. And and you meet so many nice people. This is the best part of all this. And the third one wasn't really an event like that. We've done several, but was the book fair in Glens Falls a few weeks ago. That book is now a year old, but it became so popular that stores that didn't want to carry it kept calling us and reordering. So we've had orders from stores. I spend a lot of time packing books. You can't complain about it. It's a lot of work, but it's if somebody orders 30 books, you love it.
At some point, since you've worked so hard on this for so many years, there has to be an event or a book that turns the page and opens up new doors for you. And this, let's hope that this book or one of the others is the one for you, because it's about time.
Yeah, well, the problem is I don't know what turning the page means, because a book like that, you could say, you could do a local tour, you could go national, because people everywhere, we just shipped one to Colorado yesterday. You ship them all over. People, they call a relative, say, you got to read this book. So we do that, but I'm not sure what I really would want out of, if you do all that, you really can't sit home and write another book either, because you're busy traveling. So that becomes difficult.
A made-for-TV movie?
Yeah, things like that. I mean, when you start looking at a movie, if it doesn't go to a movie, it might be television, and it might be one of the cable channels that do all the crime things.
Could be anything. Could be a Dateline documentary. It could be any number of things, and you'll talk to anybody.
Yeah, and now a few weeks ago, there's a one place to make some connections. We went to the Chronicle Book Fair in Glens Falls, their 15th year. And I did have that book there last year, but it had just come out. It got a lot of attention, but I wasn't one of the stars of the show. Now, they have 120 authors, publishers, and booksellers. Almost everybody you've heard of north of Albany, the good ones are there. So we went this time, but they were more excited about the story because they knew this just keeps going and going. So she assigned a reporter to me, and they interviewed me over the phone a few times. They asked me for some photos, and when I got down there, I walked in, and I was like treated like a celebrity when I walked in, and he said, "We promoted the heck out of you." They ran 2 stories in their newspaper, and the show was from 11 to 4 on a Sunday. A lot of people are watching football, but I'll tell you, from 11 to 4, it was about 20 minutes to 4 when I finally had a chance to catch my breath.
Really? People
were at us, shaking hands. I was signing books. They were telling me they love to tell their stories connected to the Robert Garrow story. So even a bathroom break, when I did finally get out, I came back in and there were about 8 people in front of the table. So that was great because you make a lot of connections, and we sold a lot of books that day. I know we were probably good chance we were the best seller at the whole thing. And what happens is, if we sold 60-something books that day, 60 people went home. As soon as they read it,
that's how it works.
They give a call, and we had a lot of orders since then, online orders.
But based on all of this reaction, you wouldn't consider any kind of a sequel, or would you? Based on those stories people have been telling you, or?
No, because, it's interesting, and that's one of my favorite parts of doing this, is that, like, you write about the Altona Flat Rock, and then you meet people who pick berries there.
Sure.
And that's the fun. They tell you their stories. So that's part of the fun of it. But as far as selling that would be difficult. You have to get people to buy what you write, and to get somebody to take $20 out of their pocket for something, it better be good.
You started doing this for the fun of it, and now
right.
It has to equal, something else has to be in the equation these days.
Right, it's the first time I've really done what I like, and I do like it. Now, when I had to send for a reprint of that book, we had also, these are 2 others, we sold out of both of these. And enough people asked us that, we thought we really should do it. It's very, very expensive to do, but I reprinted some of the Altona book recently.
Just briefly tell us what that's about.
Well, near Altona, there's a really unique area called the Flat Rock, and it's home to many things, but one thing was the blueberry business, and that was the key to the story. And people would, every summer, especially, well, it happened 100 years ago, but during the Depression, the families would go out there and live in tents for 3 or 4 weeks or a month at a time and pick berries, and that's how they made their living. And it was an important income for the coming winter. Just like people used to pick hops up in Franklin County. So that book had sold out. We've done 2 printings already, but when you have even 15 requests, that's quite a bit for people to say, hey, how can I get one? So we finally just decided the sales on Garrow had done well enough, and it's a really big investment, because I reprinted Garrow, I reprinted that, and this book is also the same story. That I've already printed that 3 times, The Tragedy of a Mining Town. But it sold out again, and the museum...
People talk about this to me all the time.
Right. The museum is without books because they finally ran out, and I feel awful that they don't have it.
Explain to people that there's
a museum in Line Mountain dedicated. It's a Line Mountain Mining and Railroad Museum. So they had a list of about 15 people that wanted it, and what I do, like when you sell books, you're going to get a shipment from the printer, and there's going to be some damage somewhere. There's going to be something with an upside-down cover. You just never know. So you have to be careful about when you ship them. So at the end of selling, say, 1,000 copies, I might have 30 books set aside that have bent pages or creased or dirty or something. So as far as that book, The Tragedy of a Mining Town, I had at least 70 copies that were what I consider seconds or damaged that you might
No
sell at a used
kidding.
bookstore. But what happens, people started calling and saying, I said, well, I don't have any, we're sold out. Well, I do have one that has a page that is out, but I put it in place, the entire content, just like that. Don't even let me finish. Send it. So about 6 months ago, I sold the last of those. I don't have any. I sold all what I would have called garbage. So then I didn't want the museum to be without. So we finally decided, because I had made some money off the terror book, to go ahead and invest. So we did Altona, we did Tragedy and Terror at the same time, and printed a new book too. Now, one thing I had to do though, I had to find a way to do this economically because it's so expensive. So that Lion Mountain Tragedy book originally was this thick, and it looked like this. So there is
There is a difference.
Yes, but what I did was, because
Yeah.
it's economical to do a certain number of pages, so I took some of the full-size photos and I reduced them to appear horizontally. So they were smaller, so I could reduce the page count, and I also changed the font size from 12 to 11, and I could reduce the book by
I
maybe...
like 12. That's
Right.
good.
But it's still plenty readable, so I had to do that. In fact, in 2 weeks' time, I had to redo the entire Altona book
Oh, gosh.
and the Line Mountain book. But I got it done, and they came back in pretty nice shape, so we've been selling them now, too.
We're talking with Larry Gooley of Bloated Toe Enterprises. We're at his place of business today, just on a day before Thanksgiving in the year 2010. A lot of these would make good Christmas gifts,
yes.
wouldn't they?
Yeah, that's starting to happen now, yes.
Oh, that's good. This time of year is good for you. You sell other people's books too.
Yes, I've probably got 100 titles in the store, and some music. There's CDs. There's other things. We used to carry some food items, but you don't get as many sales online, and it's not a good idea. I didn't realize at the time to carry perishables, because eventually you better eat
No
them.
kidding.
But I have some pretty good stuff I've been eating that that I didn't sell.
I love it. Yeah, and you talked about mistakes. The first thing that happened to me when my book was published, called The Ghosts of Clinton County, I flipped it over and noticed on the back page they spelled Potsdam wrong.
Yeah.
And I said, okay, Larry didn't do this one, I guess.
No, but hey, if I do it at some point, it eats at me forever. I mean, I actually did once. A man told me how to. I spelled his name for him, and he told me that was correct, and I published it, and it wasn't correct. His daughter told me later. I was just amazed, but I have to take blame for the mistake. But he actually told me, he was an old Frenchman, and he said, no, that's fine, that's fine. Well, it was fine, but it wasn't right. He should have told me.
Well, with,
it was just a simple,
French names, you can throw it
Right.
up in the air. Whatever comes down might be okay.
It was, it was a simple L-E or L-A, and
Yeah.
that's what it was. So when his daughter corrected it, I did end up doing a reprint, so I corrected it. But other than that,
It must be hell for you to read a newspaper or anybody else's book, because you're
Yeah.
looking for those mistakes.
Right.
I printed business cards sometime back and have given away hundreds and hundreds of them. And I was down south and gave one to a woman in a restaurant. And she said, "What's Morrisonville MY?"
M-Y.
I said, "Oh no,
Yeah.
it's little tiny print that I can't even see anyway." But
Right.
that's people are laughing at that business card.
I notice that, like, when I send an email, if I don't really zoom in to see it, once in a while I make a mistake, and I despise that. Now, that Plants of St. Lawrence County, that book, when the women, we went back and forth to say, is the editing finished? And when they finally pronounced it finished, I was supposed to send it out that Friday, but I wrote back to Nancy and said, I can't. I said, I know. I said, I know that from what I found last time, there has to be more. So I emailed her on Monday and said, I found 23 things that I would have corrected. Maybe quotation marks out of place, or a word that wasn't quite right, or an extra space between words. That's hard to pick up visually. But I've developed tricks to do it, because it's so important to me, and it's so difficult to do. To read your own writing and edit it is very, very difficult.
But you know what? I read books a lot, as you do. And it's hard for me, and I'm not an editor or a publisher, it's hard for me to get through a book without finding several mistakes of one kind or another.
Yes, and
So it happens in
Yeah.
the biggest of houses.
right, factual was the worst, though. I had to, I question everything when I read it, and that helps whoever wrote it, because don't assume that I know something. If I don't know what that is, I'm going to look it up, and I found a lot of factual mistakes, and that's important. You hate it if anything like a spelling, that would be just mortifying for me if a spelling error got by, but you know, you just shoot for perfection, and then you'll end up pretty good.
So you yourself have written how many books now?
9. I just released my 9th.
It's 9. Okay. What else have you got over there? We got to get through this stack here, man.
This is the one that.
This is the one you're most proud of as we speak.
Yes. Well, I always mention my mom. My mom is a native of Churubusco.
How can you not mention your mom?
In fact, I don't know if we've actually shown my mom, but right there.
Oh, you got her picture in the book?
Yes, and there's another person there you're familiar with. That's my mom's aunt, Aunt Alice Silver.
Oh, gosh.
Alice was, I think, 103 when she died, but she was,
gosh.
That's one of the birthday, I think we were up there for the 101st birthday party.
My.
So I dedicated the book to Aunt Alice and my mom. And,
did she ever get her helicopter ride?
No, I don't think she did.
Come on, that's the one thing she wanted out of life, was to get a ride in a helicopter. I think she did, though. I think she either told us it was happening or was going to happen. The helicopter was going to land in the prison parking lot.
Oh, she may have.
And they were, maybe that's what killed her.
I think the only thing she didn't do, she said she would parachute at some point.
There is, if I were smart enough to get on YouTube, I would take that little clip from the end of our interview with Alice when she was singing a Body Barroom song, which took us totally off guard, and Calvin's finger was twitching on the camera, and I had all I could do to keep from gurgling and laughing. And she was singing, she had all the lyrics right there, big as life, and who could fault her at age 103?
At that birthday party, towards the end, I didn't know this was going to happen, but they were playing music, and they goaded her into getting up. She got up and started dancing around. I think she was 101 at the time, and then she did what you just said. She sang one of those lovely little songs. She knew them all,
and all the lyrics. And so, let's talk about the history of Churubusco. You laid the groundwork the last time we were here, and what you were doing with this book. Well, and now it's done.
This book, it's kind of strange the way it came about. My mom was always, you know, when I'm always working on something, and she'll say, well, why don't you write about Churubusco? And I put it in there in the introduction. It's, well, what is there to write? You know, back in 1976, Churubusco did a book about maybe a 1/4 inch thick, and it has tons of historical information. And a lot of it is very valuable to researchers because it'll tell you the history of each home. As you go down the road, this house was owned by a certain person, sold to this and this. And what happened was I was actually at a wake, I think late last year, and someone approached me about helping them do a reprint because they knew I was in the publishing business. So I agreed to help them, and I began going up to Churubusco for meetings. And it wasn't exactly a falling out, but what happened was there are so many more sources available today than there were in 1976. It's kind of strange, but there's more history available now than there was back then.
Oh, sure.
So I explained to them that there is so much I can find and so many details on the history of the town that I think you should add this to your book. And they were interested. So I said, well, you know, I've read some of what they've written, and I thought they needed somebody to write it a little more professionally, some of it. So I said, well, what I'll do is research it, and I'll write some pieces for you, and I'll show you. So we had a few meetings, and when I finally brought several chapters for them to read, I thought, you know, I was all excited because I found so many things about Churubusco where I spent a ton of my childhood there, but I didn't know about some of these things. So I thought they would be thrilled, and they were to an extent, but I think the feeling was that I had gone too far and that the story was too far-reaching, and the comment was, this is too much for people. So we discussed it back and forth, and I was going to continue working with them, but they decided to go back to their original project. Now, at that point, I've got 3 months of research and writing involved.
Of course.
So I explained to them, well, here's what I'll do. I'll continue working with you if you'd like. I'll do my own Churubusco book, but I'll do it completely separate from yours, and I'll release mine maybe a month or two after yours so it doesn't affect your sales. But they decided to take a different route, and I told them, you know, I explained, and you know, I know the historian very well, and I just said, well, I have to follow my path too. I can't just leave that research hanging, and I think it's important. I said, a lot of this, I'm learning it like any layman learns it, and it's so exciting, I couldn't believe it. So that's what I did. And until recently, their book wasn't coming out, and I couldn't wait any longer, so I had to release mine. Because, you know, if you're going to sell books, you want it available for Christmas, and you want to trigger other sales. So I spent much of the year working on this while I'm working on other projects. And my mom was right. There's a lot to write about Churubusco.
Mama's always right.
But I'll tell you, Mom's right, but even Mom will tell you right now, she didn't know most of this. On the cover, I decided to go with a collage.
I like that collage, yeah.
And, you know, some people from Churubusco are going to be looking at it and saying, can you identify each one of those? And, I thought, first of all, this was a great idea. If you're doing Churubusco, you have to have a cow on the cover.
You gotta have cows.
But there's a reason for that particular breed being on there. Is that one of the chapters deals with two of the main families behind the big business that developed in Churubusco of making butter and cheese and selling it commercially. And that became the #1 milk producing breed in the world, and that's what that man had a herd of those Dutch belted, they call them. Dutch belted cattle.
See, they have the one.
Yep. So I went with the collage to show different parts of the history, and I knew it would get a few people guessing as to what they're seeing.
Yeah.
But there's just a great story behind each one, and some of these are so big, I was shocked. I just could not believe the historical connections from that tiny little place. It's also confusing because we'll say the village of Churubusco, but it's not a village. It's just, according to the government, it's a population center because it's not.
Yeah, that's a catch-all phrase for you.
Right. It's not incorporated as a village, and when people say, like Dick's Country Store, Churubusco, well, everybody knows technically it's not in Churubusco, it's in the town of Clinton, because there is no town of Churubusco, which I wish they would have named it that. But
well, you gave him a good shot in here.
Oh yeah, he's very excited about the book. In fact, we just launched this on the 19th, and I had it
at his store.
Yes, I had it a week before that. But when Dick had contacted me about possibly doing an event there, we had plans earlier to do something, but now with this book, he was pretty excited. So I said, it's no problem holding off on sales for about a week or 10 days, because when I first started trying to sell my books locally, I created the business, and I was giving the stores very little, $2 or $3 a copy. Now, that doesn't really mean much to them, maybe to a small store, but to Dick's store is pretty busy. But he was nice enough to say, I'll carry them, and I've been carrying on that relationship since late 2004. So when the chance came to do this, I said, absolutely. But I tell you, when you do a book signing in Churubusco, I'll call it, you don't expect it to be that good. But it was great.
No reflection on Churubusco.
No, there's just not that many people in the whole town. There used to be, maybe there were a few thousand, but when you're down to a population of 700, and that counts all the little children, that's not that many people.
And if it hadn't been for the wind towers, there'd be a little less publicity about Churubusco. I want to, besides the wonderful information you have in this book, Larry Gooley, you have collected a group of photographs that are astounding. And it's interesting, I think, to explain to people how you found all the photographs. I mean, you've got pictures of people, famous people and infamous people, and cows and farms and railroad stations and schools, but you also have extracted the most delightful and, yes, even delicious ads, advertising things, and people focus on that stuff. They love the old ads.
And I really wasn't sure how well it would come off, but I do know that from my St. Mary's background, I knew what a good book was supposed to look like, and I knew what kind of books I really enjoyed. So instead of worrying about what people thought if I ran an old ad, I just said, well, this really illustrates what I'm trying to say. And especially in this case, because there are no newspapers in Churubusco, and most of the news was in Franklin County in the Chateauguay Record, most people here haven't even seen these, but they advertise their businesses in Franklin County. So it ties right to history, because it at least tells you who ran the place or who owned the business. And it's always, it's interesting anyway, to me. And I thought, well, if it's interesting to me, maybe everybody else will find it interesting. So I did use it to illustrate many parts of the book, especially if I knew there was a place called Ryan's Store. There were probably several, but there was a Ryan's Store. Well, if you run an ad for Ryan's Store with the picture, it kind of puts the whole thing together. So I did a lot of that, and that Google that we mentioned a while ago, it's a tremendously valuable research tool that most writers are probably missing out on. Because I don't want them scanning my books, but they're scanning books. They're scanning government documents from the 1700s and 1800s, which most people would consider junk. And it is to most people. But sometimes, you know, like when I'm looking through a document and it says in the 1860s, somebody from the town of Clinton bid on building the, I think it was the breakwater in Burlington. I was all excited right away. I thought, this is fantastic. And even though he didn't get the winning bid, I still thought it was a great story, so I included it, that these people aren't just living up in the woods, you know, they were out and about finding business, and actually Churubusco created a lot of the business that ran Clinton County for years and years. I mean, it was really, really important stuff that has kind of disappeared. It's not recorded anywhere.
I love this one on page 114. Look at this little ad. Ben Franklin.
Well, you know, my mom's always
That jumped right out at you, didn't it, Larry?
My mom's always told me about my famous relatives. I had an uncle Simon Legree and an uncle Ben.
Did you really?
And an uncle Ben Franklin.
Oh my
and
goodness!
When I saw this, you notice the spelling too.
Of course,
the spelling of Churubusco is wrong. So I wanted, you know, I said, well, this is a neat ad. Plus, it ties in with the story of the potato.
But
business.
it's the way a lot of people pronounce it, Churubusco.
Yeah,
Churubusco.
That's one important part of the book. It may have seemed small to some people, but Churubusco's name was originally spelled Cherubusco. So it was C-H-E, and that was wrong. But nobody seemed to know it, and from the 1840s right to the early 1900s, that's how it appeared. And when you search the old newspapers, you'll start to see C-H-U sometimes. But all that was recorded was in the Churubusco book. They mentioned that in the 1930s it was changed by the postmaster. Well, I just wanted to know the true story behind this. And I'm telling you, when I looked, and I spent over a week, and I'm talking long days and a week, and it's so frustrating that I decided, you've just got to give it up. But I couldn't. I went back to it again, and the answer was out there somewhere, and in some remote government document from the late 1800s, and it's a huge book, and it's a tiny little entry of 3 lines, and I put it in there. What happened was...
I'm laughing. That's not even funny.
As the U.S. mail began to spread, you know, the country grew out west, you start to realize that there's places called maybe Champlain, New York, maybe Champlain, Illinois. It just keeps going and going. So for mail delivery, this becomes an issue. So the president finally recognized this from all the complaints, and they formed a commission to designate what names were going to be the official government spelling. That's what they had to do. I didn't know they had done this, but during research I found that. While going through that monster book, I finally found the exact entry, and I put it in there word for word, in quotation marks. It says C-H-U-R-U. That was the official change. So that's when the post office had to change it. And from then on, it's been correct.
And post office designations have affected the way Plattsburgh is spelled,
Right.
and many other burgs across the
Right. A lot of people wonder where the H went on some of those. Well, sometimes it was a government
Where the H
document.
did the H
Sure.
go?
Yeah, but the government made it official. So I try to do something neat once in a while with the pictures. This on page 18,
Okay, I got it.
the Churubusco train depot. There's an old oval picture that I ran above the other one, and you'll see the spelling on the building has been changed from C-H-E to C-H-U, but those were the 2 spellings used all those years. And it's in the end you find out that actually if you look at the source of the name Churubusco, it comes from a village in Mexico where an important battle was fought in what they used to call the Mexican-American War, or the War with Mexico, in 1847. And if you look on the maps, it's on the Churubusco River, and it's always spelled with C-H-U. So it could have been corrected a long time ago, but that is the official spelling.
And in this book somewhere, I saw a lithograph by Currier and Ives depicting the Battle of Churubusco.
Oh, yes. And on the cover, actually, there's a different one. On the cover, that's the actual convent.
Oh, it is. This
Yep.
one up here in the corner.
Yes. It's an unusual... I knew that, you know, the North Country has strong religious ties. And I know how devout they are in Churubusco. I spent most of my childhood there. Every weekend we had to go to Churubusco. And it turned out that the name is really from an unusual source. It has to do with blood sacrifice and things like that when the Spanish came in. And the Spanish witnessed the Aztecs doing this, and they decided this wasn't a good thing. So the story is in the book, but I'll just briefly tell what they did was when they finally decided we're taking this place over, the Spanish, they wiped out that place of sacrifice. And there are stories that there were anywhere, in one case, in one event, 20,000 to 80,000 human sacrifices.
Come on.
They have what they call codex that details everything that was done. So the Spanish tore that down. They built us, I think it was like a small chapel or something, and they gave it a name, and this place became Churubusco. So that Churubusco's roots are actually in that old Aztec site, but it grew into from a chapel into a convent, and the convent, as you can see by that picture, really looks substantial, and it was more really like a small fort. So when the Mexicans were retreating, and they had just been defeated, I can't remember the name of the place, but it's not too far away. They retreated to Churubusco. They decided this is going to be our stand right here. So they took a stand, and the Americans made several attacks before they finally drove them out. And that was the Battle of Churubusco. One historian calls that one of the 100 most important battles in history. I don't know if it is, but it became kind of interesting in another way for me because there's so many Irish in Churubusco. And there's a famous Irish group of men that deserted from the U.S. that fought on the side of Mexico in that battle. And some of them were executed afterward for treason when they were captured.
Who would ever know this?
So it's just
unless Larry Gooley told them.
Well, you need to know. Once you start digging, you just have to know. So I kept digging, and that is a tourist place to visit now.
Yeah.
And I knew years ago when I was a young boy, I remember them showing us pictures of Churubusco Studios. There's a famous movie studio.
There are people, I'm sure every person watching this program, no matter how old they are, who have heard of the famous letter to Santa Claus that was published in the New York Sun. And the headline, "Yes, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus." So for some reason, Larry Gooley decided to look in the old papers and pick out a whole bunch of letters to Santa Claus from little kids in Churubusco. I wonder if your mother's letter's in there.
No, my mom's not in there. My aunt, Pat, Aunt Alice's daughter.
Yeah.
Pat, she's in there.
Pat's in there.
Yeah.
Is Pat still live in the same place?
I think so, yes. I know I've been in touch with her by email, but I haven't been up to visit her. And actually on the first page of the letters, because I went up for the book signing, I couldn't wait to show him. On the bottom right, Dick Decos's dad from back in 1920.
Oh, come on.
Paul from 1922.
He must have loved it.
During research, I would see those letters from kids from Chateauguay and Churubusco. And part of it really is historically valuable because nowadays, if your grandchildren probably want an Xbox or something, but back then, if you read those letters, you start to see a theme. I want some fruit, some candy, and nuts, maybe a couple of toys, a toy for my little brother.
Kids don't have a clue. A dolly, a jackknife,
right?
A train,
and it was
a sled.
Right. It was a simpler time, but it was poignant for me to be reading those, and I decided that, geez, these people, if I love it this much, they're going to love it. So I collected several, and I tried to fit them.
You know, my wife and I have talked about it all the time. This is an aside, but connected, because with poor families, and many of us were poor families, whether you're from Churubusco or not, and then there was a special Christmas stocking, and it's vivid in my mind's eye, what it looked like. It was made out of green felt and had a little, now we would call it plastic Santa Claus on the top. But if I got an orange and a banana, and maybe one other small thing like a jackknife or something in that stocking, that was a really, really big deal.
Yeah.
So the fruit at Christmas time, you know,
well, you mentioned it's in there. Many times kids ask for a banana.
Yeah.
You know, just as a Christmas present. Just it's hard to get to grasp that now, that it's how things have changed so much because it's so commercialized, and then it was just something personal.
Just to let people know, Larry, when you start this book, you do an immense amount of research. I think that should be obvious by what's in the book and what you've told us. But then you've got stacks and stacks and stacks of information, and then you have to figure out what order to put it in.
Right.
How did you determine what order to put all this information in for this history of Churubusco? You can't just start it on a timeline and work it from the beginning to the present.
No, I generally like to work chronologically because when some books that I've read in the past, it turned me off to see that I went from 1860 to 1900 back to 1880. It was confusing if I wanted to learn it. But in this case, it was more the subject that was important, each subject. Because, like you just turned to smuggling. Well, smuggling was very important in the 1800s, but also just 20 or 30 years ago. There's even a recent one in there, was $1 billion operation.
Yeah.
So it's chronologically within each chapter was the best way to do it, really.
Oh, I see, okay.
So, because the subject matter was so important and so different. Like I did something on line stores. They're also called line houses. I have to do a book on that someday. It's a building that actually straddles the U.S.-Canada border. And there were so many of these.
I know about the buildings, but never knew they were called line
houses or line stores.
No kidding.
Right, and a great way to smuggle was if you came in from Canada, well, before you go through customs, you go stop in the store with the kids, and you can shop around in there, and then Dad can go drive through customs and go park on the other side, and then pick the kids up with whatever they had that didn't go through customs. And people from Churubusco will tell you that was done many times. I did interviews, but most of this is just from research and old documents and things like that. Oh, on the military chapter, something that was really amazing to me, Hurd's History of Clinton and Franklin Counties. Now that's one of our basic research books in the North Country. And I didn't plan on doing a complete look at the military from Churubusco. But as it grew into that, I knew a man was said to have died in prison during the Civil War. So I wanted to know about that. It drove me crazy not knowing. So as I kept digging, I turned to that book and I said, well, a good place to start is let's take this. Right at the end of that chapter on Clinton, they've got a list of 50 names that were involved in the Civil War. So I thought, this is fantastic. And I started to search, and as I dug through the records I found online, I couldn't find any of them. And I recognized some of those last names, just from being up in the North Country, and I said, these really sound like Ausable people, a lot of these, Well, eventually I make the discovery, I was shocked, that almost every one of those 50 names is from the town of Ausable. And then I didn't realize at first, as I'm reading, it finally clicks. I'm in the town of Clinton. They formed Clintonville down there around the same time. Mistakenly put most of the men from Clintonville in the town of Clinton. So at that point, now I'm in big trouble. I have to go back and find who was in the Civil War from Churubusco. And I eventually found a fantastic source of records of when men signed up, where they signed up, how long they served, and when they left. So that became critical because I did track down the man who died in prison. There were a few other, there might be a regiment from northern New York. Well, it never really dawned on me that much that most of the guys from northern New York only served in that regiment. So a lot of them were friends from the same town. There were at least 2 or 3 men from Churubusco in an important battle down there that the North lost, and several men were captured and imprisoned. A couple of them came home, some were never heard from again, and one, they were there when he starved to death. So they could tell the family this, but I needed to find these records, and eventually I tracked down which prison they were sent to and where he died. To me, that was important. So I ended up having to list every person I could find who was from Churubusco, who later collected their
pension?
Yes, their pension in Busco, or signed up in one of the locations in Churubusco, because some people may not have been from Churubusco, but they signed up at the little settlement of Frontier. So I did put a list of that in there. So then that grew into more trouble, because there were several men who died in, say, World War I and World War II from the town of Clinton. And I found their gravestones, and I found just the brief story, but I didn't want to just put what everybody knew. If you already know it, then what's the point of putting it in a book? So I started to dig, and as you know, the military records, you can track where different regiments served. So one man I was told, and I say a very, very sharp person from Churubusco said this person died at Pearl Harbor. And I had to, that was my mom.
I knew you were getting there.
I had to tell her, no, he didn't die there. He was there, but he didn't die there. And then I had to really learn the whole story of I Shall Return, MacArthur. I had to learn that whole story of in the bay at the Philippines where he was on Corregidor Island, this guy from Churubusco was. And he had been inland. He eventually ended up on Corregidor, and then they were overrun. And he was captured, and they sent them to certain group of prison camps, so I knew where he was. And then within 3 camps, but almost certainly the one that he died in. And then I did put pictures in there of the monuments that they have. It's amazing the things you learn while you're doing this. is that these huge cemeteries, page 172, the huge cemeteries, these are all Americans.
Yep.
Just amazing to me that, you know, people can find this online, of course, but pictures of where some of the Churubusco men are buried, because some of them didn't come home. And it was an interesting thing the government did do was years later, around 1930, after World War I, when there were, they paid for the mothers of the deceased, a lot of children and husbands, they paid for them to go overseas to visit these cemeteries. And then there are others also, like I said, from Corregidor. There's, I think, 4 Churubusco men that died in World War II. So I had to include all that. So I went on through to try to get a list of everybody who served in Korea. There was another one that died in Korea. He survived World War II, but went to Korea and died there. So, but I need to know where. I want to know what battle he was in and how it happened. And with him, I did actually find they were retreating through a narrow valley and facing fire from both sides, and he didn't make it through. So I don't even know if the families knew this, but that's what I needed to know it. So I tracked all that and listed as many as I could with the details of what happened.
There were a few famous people that lived in Churubusco, and you've mentioned everybody you could find.
Well, on the cover, there's one man in particular. I'm not sure if that's who you were referring to, but this man on the top center is Thomas Burke.
Oh, yes.
And born almost right across from Dick Decos's store. And I think he lived there till he was around 12 years old. But to discover who he was, I'm telling you, I was amazed just day after day. And I actually was in, I think it was last year, I was in Seattle. This man became one of the founders of the state of Washington and the city of Seattle. He's revered there. They have monuments to him. I put photos of the monuments. Yeah. And actually on the cover, I think it's on the grounds of Washington State, the Burke Museum.
Oh, yes. I saw that one in the beginning.
Named after Thomas Burke. And the other one that struck me so much was, they just referred to him as Bill Bray. And he always went by M. William Bray. This was just stunning to me. This man moved to Utica, became he was much admired attorney and became a powerful political man because he helped someone get elected, and he was just clean and upright, and there was nothing, it was just politics, you know. He was very good at it. The state recognized that he won for the party where no one else had won, and he eventually got state party chairman. And at one point, he was so important, he was so close to FDR, who was our state governor, and this is one of the most famous politicians in American history, that just like they do today, the Republicans complained that, well, FDR's a governor, but he's just Bill Bray's mouthpiece. And I just thought, this is what a fantastic quote. This is a guy from Churubusco, a farmer. And shortly after that, Bray was he liked the idea of patronage, that if your party was in power now, you should reward the guys that helped you. And, you know, not completely, but there were a few spots where you would put your own man in, which is normal. But FDR went against him on one of those, and right away they had a falling out. And I thought, this is just going to ruin the whole story. But actually, it became, the crux of the story was, this little farm guy from Clinton now became friend and foe of FDR. And FDR had some of the most powerful political men in history.
Oh,
Farley.
Yeah.
There's hardly anybody more powerful than he was. They repeatedly tried to get rid of Bill Bray. They, not really to destroy him, but they did. He was against the New Deal. He didn't believe in some of those things that FDR was doing. He was against those kinds of ideas. So he began to fight against them, and they just said, well, we're dumping this guy. But Bill Bray was so popular up north, now not just up here, but in the Utica area, where he just an upright citizen and defender of everything, you know, it's just, everybody just loved him. So it was too solid. Every time they decided he's out, no matter what. When they went to do it, they knew the party would split, and that the Tammany folks, the Democratic part in New York City, would take over. So each time they tried to get rid of him, it didn't work. And I was amazed. But then, not only that, he becomes so popular, he gets elected lieutenant governor. And it's kind of an odd thing how you run, because didn't it just happen, I think, that in Vermont you can have say a Democratic governor, but a Republican lieutenant governor. Well, he won, and FDR's guy also won as governor. So Bill Bray serves a term, and they decide, well, we've got to get rid of him now. But he runs again, and he fought back, and he was so popular, he outpolled the governor by far. Now, this really irritated them. Bill Bray won a third term. It's just amazing, and they kept trying to get rid of him, and I detailed the entire story, and they just could not do it. The Syracuse papers kept up on it, and they said it's just a tough spot because they want to dump him, but they say, well, let's get rid of him in a nice way. Let's make him a judge. Let's give him some other really important job. And he just kept turning them down. So he played the game all the way through. And it's just remarkable that he could stand up to such powerful men. And with his background coming from a farm in Churubusco. I just thought it was amazing.
How could you not have an area in your book dedicated to Churubusco weather? Because I have read, and so have you, hundreds of old farmers' diaries, farmers' almanacs, and so on, where they talk about the weather because, and rural life depends on knowing what's going to happen tomorrow. Mm-hmm. You also found some wonderful photographs.
Well, Diane Legree is the historian. And when after they went on their book and I went separately on mine, I went up there to do some more research, and Diane showed me all the photos they had. And these really were probably considered insignificant because they're just someone's snapshots. But it happened to be I was doing a chapter on the weather, and when you have a picture of people coming down the main highway and the men are standing on the snowbank looking down at the plow.
You love it. Don't you love it?
And it happened to be in sets of, I could find sets of 3, so I set them up that way in the book. And I was thrilled because my mom's from Churubusco, and when I was a kid, almost every Sunday you had to get in the car, and a 35-mile drive when you're a little kid is a long ways to go. And we had to go up there all the time, and we're familiar with getting snowed in a few times in Churubusco. And I used to go in the woods up there, and I knew how tough it was. And I lived in Moore's Forks for a long time. When you move up from Champlain to Moore's Forks, even as you're driving up there, you'll see a sudden change because of the elevation.
It's like Tug Hill,
right.
Sure.
And you think it's horrible, and it can be. But then from Cannon's Corners, when I went up to Churubusco, you take another step deeper,
When they used to say it's a different world, they weren't kidding, were they?
It is.
And I noticed a reference, even in the New York Sun, we mentioned the New York Sun, 1902. Mm-hmm. New York Sun says a cut half a mile in length and 40 feet deep between Ellenburg and Brandy Brook on the Rutland Railroad has been completely blocked with snow since the big blizzard several days ago. 3 engines and a snow plow, P-L-O-U-G-H,
yeah,
right?
The way they spelled it.
You got it. While endeavoring to make the opening through the cut were derailed. Mm-hmm. We're talking snowstorms.
That's just amazing to me. There were so many stories like that you had to select. There were just the things that happened to people.
Just wonderful stuff.
That one you just paged by, that was a story I'd often heard when I was a child.
This one?
Yeah, my grandfather used to tell me, he had a farm, and he said we would actually, because of the weather, he said some men died going to the barn, they got lost. And he said one way to do it was as the snow built up, you have a path shoveled through and you pretty much maintain a tunnel. That's really what you're walking in.
Exactly
It might not have a top or it might have a top. But I did find several deaths related to exactly what he said, and this became a famous story, really famous, infamous, because this woman decided she was going to go get her children from school, and it wasn't very far away, and it's not too far down the road from where Dick Degas' store is. And it just became legendary up there. She tried to make it to the school, and it seemed to take hours, and she made it to a neighbor's, and the neighbor, the story is confused in another book that you'll read, but the neighbor made it to the school, brought the kids back to his house and told the woman, you stay with us. But she insisted, I have a baby at home with my husband and I have to get home. So she tried to make it home, and it was a tremendous storm, and the next morning he thought she made it home, the husband thought she stayed there, and they began searching. And she told how she was even sitting there. She had 3 children with her, and 2 of the kids froze, or one of the children, I think 2 of them died.
Yeah, I can't remember.
And
one
that
or two,
little girl,
I read the story.
yes, so, 4 children. 2 of the girls died, and then she had that little girl with her, and the boy, they survived.
Unbelievable stories. Here's some of these pictures. The one you were talking about, the guys looking down from the top of the snowbanks. Because I remember these things from my early childhood.
I just talked to a man the other day. I'm sure you've heard this story. They said, well, when it built up so much, to get out the next day, we just step out the second-story window. That's how they got out of the house.
How many times?
Yeah.
Even in your young lifetime, you can remember storms like that back in the 80s and 90s.
But because there was snow removal was different. Back then, you could actually step over the telephone wires. Yeah. That's what you did. The banks were that high.
Well, they didn't have the means of removing the snow from the roadsides. And they had what we would now consider rather rudimentary methods for plowing snow.
And rolling.
And rolling snow.
Sure.
The big rollers you can find at Blue Mountain Lake Adirondack Museum. Young kids would have no idea what that was before. That was to pack it down, baby. And boy, can you imagine what those springs were like in those days?
Now, I don't know if you have time for another
I got time.
story. Well, the picture in the center, that was one that really interested me on the front page, the
Yeah.
front cover. Well, when I was about 16 years old, Woodstock had just happened. You know, back then, of course, you have to put yourself within the times, living through JFK, the assassination, Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King. You know, it was a really horrible time in history.
Yeah.
And Woodstock was a lot of things to a lot of people, but for one, it was just people letting go, not having to deal with all this every day. And it became the idea like, wow, that was so great, let's do it somewhere else. And when a guy got the idea to do the Churubusco Live-In, and this was going to be probably the preeminent follow-up to Woodstock. They purchased property and they had ticket sales going on, and they expected a crowd of 200,000. Sales were going great, and don't forget they had Montreal, Boston, and New York.
Oh, yeah.
So they knew people were coming from everywhere, but this was going to be huge. So one of my favorite groups when I was a kid, Steppenwolf, was going to be there.
Oh.
And this is going to be held right across the road from my grandfather's farm. He's got a 100-acre farm. This is heaven for me, you know. But eventually, you know, the reality sets in that people have to pay for services, and how is this going to happen? And as I write in the book, when you finally think about it in a different way, you're going to triple the county population, not the town. The entire county population would triple for about 3 days now.
Yeah.
How could you possibly take care of that medically or any other way? So Churubusco fought it, and you remember one of our local legends, J. Byron O'Connell, he got involved. The beginning of that chapter's got a beautiful quote from him. Did you see that?
Yes, of course I did.
You're absolutely going to love that. I knew him, and when you could...
Did we all know him?
I could just see his face saying that, because, you know, he was full of bluster.
Yeah.
And he needed to... He was representing Churubusco's interest to stop this concert. Now, that quote appeared in the Boston newspapers about people coming up to Churubusco just
yeah.
might be shot.
Yep.
Yeah, so maybe we look like rednecks, but they didn't want the concert to happen.
We've all got stories about J. Byron O'Connell, some of which probably should not be discussed in this venue.
Yeah, he's quite a
but
guy.
the Churubusco Live-In was it, and once again, young people have no idea what we're talking about,
Right.
right?
And it didn't happen, but it is a great story. So I have all the details of everything that happened.
O'Connell assured the audience if they try to do without a license, they'll all go to jail. If they try to do anything, even dig the toilets without a license, they're
Right. Now, on the next page or a little further, you'll see parts of that famous, or now infamous, Churubusco Ordinance.
Oh, yeah.
They passed laws. They passed a law so all-encompassing. I think you'll find in there it banned baseball, football, clam bakes, anything O'Connell could think of. He put everything in there. And they passed that law, which meant that you couldn't even have a cookout in Churubusco at that time. So you're not supposed to pass a law to address one thing, but basically that is what they did, and eventually rescind the law so that people can once again have cookouts and go to the bar and do things like that.
I love it. Can I just read one paragraph here with your permission? Sure. I can't duplicate J. Byron's voice. I just kicked something over. I got too excited under here. He says, that live-in will turn into a lynch-in.
Yep.
Warned J. Byron O'Connell, counsel for the 300 French-Canadian dairy farmers who populate the town. People up here aren't used to long hair. They don't fool around with legal niceties, and they're not going to put up with any nonsense from college kids, said O'Connell. If they come up Route 189, they're just liable to get shot.
Yep. And that appeared in big newspapers in Boston and New York.
Oh, my.
So that helped, really. And there were a lot of concerts that met with the same fate that were planned but didn't happen. Oh, here's some of that map. I had to throw that in. I had to squeeze everything in because that shows, you know, there's a Lost Nation Road up there.
Of course.
What an awesome name. And that's right across from Dick's store again.
We've been on the Lost Nation Road with Dick Decock.
Now, there's been a book quoted. There's been a citation you'll find in many places as you research, and it tells that it was once, they believe, an old Indian settlement or something like that. And it took forever. This is just like that, finding the E in Churubusco or the U. I finally found the source of that, and what happened was the original person who read it misinterpreted it. And that story is passed down in every book, every place since then.
Sure, that happens more than once.
Right, now when you look at that picture, you'll see the Lost Nation Road. Now we have to picture, this is back, say, in the 1830s, 1840s. The Lost Nation Road went north to Canada, but it went across the border several miles, maybe 4 or 5 or 3 or 4 or 5 miles. And there's not many roads back then, we have to remember. You turn left, which is west, several miles down the road, there was like a wasteland, pretty much considered a wasteland. There had been a fire, trees had burned and everything. And when people finally developed that, as they cleared the land, that's what they uncovered. And that's what he was writing about. And he wrote that it finally became developed around 1850. It had nothing to do with an Indian settlement. It was called Lost Nation because it looked like a wasteland. And it's, if you read the passage and interpret it yourself, I'm sure you'll get the same thing from it. So now when you drive over there, you realize there is a Lost Nation there. They actually have the Lost Nation Road in Canada. It slants, I think, northeast from that settlement. And then if you go a little bit south, you cut across and you drop down to Dick's Store, about maybe 15 miles by road. So the Lost Nation is actually up there.
Isn't that amazing?
And another kind of cool reference was in Plattsburgh politics, when Churubusco, when the town of Clinton was formed, 1845, shortly after, everything was very important about reaching the electorate and how they're going to vote. And you'll see in a very, just hard to find it, but an occasional reference to, well, we'll see how the Lost Nation of Churubusco will vote. They're referring to the voters way up in the northwest corner of the county. Really that place is, everybody thinks it's part of Franklin County, but it's part of Clinton County, and that's one way it was referred to.
There's so many things that have happened in that general area throughout history, and I don't think you've left too many chapters out. You even talked about the Gibson brothers.
Oh, yes.
They're a wonderful salt of the earth family, huh?
I met Eric Gibson at the signing at Dick's last week.
Oh, did you? He came over?
Yeah, he came in and we visited for a while. We traded autographs.
Oh, isn't that wonderful?
Well, I like to say I got his autograph on a check. So.
That's not hard to take either.
It's worth something to me. Oh, I also did Clinton Mills.
Yeah, of course.
Oh, I did the complete, that story, which it runs very deep because it runs through New York City. It's very important to Clinton County history. Gee, I haven't even touched on the potato business and the butter and cheese.
Oh, it's all part of it.
Those are all critical to Clinton County's history, and a lot of Clinton County history is in there. The guy that developed that, I always saw the name R.W. Adams. Well, I'll tell you what, it took me 3 days to find what R stood for. 3 days of research to finally find it. Thank goodness people were suing him. Otherwise, I wouldn't have found it, probably.
Isn't that beautiful?
And it turns out he wasn't quite the hero we make him out to be. He got involved in some financial shenanigans, and I detail the story of how Clinton Mills was formed, and then the lumber was shipped to Rouse's Point, so I found all this fascinating. There was no lumber shipped there one year, basically none, and within a few years there was thousands of tons of lumber from Clinton Mills, hauled by train directly to Rouse's Point. A lot of it went on his own canal boats down to New York City. He owned this huge expanse of shoreline. They called it Atlantic Docks, I think it was, and that's where he stored the lumber there. So much of Clinton Mills, the trees that were there, ended up sitting in New York City. And then remember, this is the 1860s. The reason people were doing this is tied to the Civil War, of course. They're rebuilding. When you're doing reconstruction, you need a lot of lumber, and that's how Clinton Mills got formed, really, just because of that. So that's where he stored the lumber there, but he got involved in some other businesses and then some crooked businesses. And I detail all that. But one thing that I never heard from my mom and other Churubusco folks was that after the community burned in one of the most historic fires in Clinton County.
Yeah, big time.
I used to live in Cannon's Corners. It burned completely from Clinton Mills to Cannon's.
All the way.
But eventually, they rebuilt a lot of it. And they did, local men picked up the business and ran it. So I tell everything about Adams and what happened to him eventually and the details on some of the lawsuits. And then local men took over. And it actually was a pretty good community running up to around maybe 1900, and eventually kind of faded because of the way things changed with the trains and the shipments of milk and things like that. It's all detailed in there, but it's just amazing how big it was. At one time it looked like it will be the center of Clinton and Churubusco would be the smaller population. But the fire did that.
Yep. Every town, every hamlet, every community has had its characters in history. And you've chronicled some of the characters over the years. Well, Reader's Digest used to have a section called My Most Unforgettable Character.
Yeah, most unforgettable character.
You had some there. In the third part of the 20th century, there was a healer in Churubusco, right?
Yeah, actually a nice connection was asking my mom, because I thought, is she really going to know about this? Because she met my dad in Churubusco. My dad's father used to manage milk plants, and at that time he was in Churubusco, so my dad actually lived there for a while, and that's how they met. So through that, I was talking to Mom one day, and I mentioned it, and she right away says, "Oh, we just called him Dr. John." I said, "So you knew who this was?" "Oh," she said, "everybody knew about him." He I don't know if to say he claimed to have this. Many people claimed he had some healing power, and as I detailed in there, I think a Syracuse reporter did a story. There was something like 200 cars there on a Sunday afternoon.
Oh, sure.
I mean, in Churubusco, but they came from everywhere because they claimed he had healed his son and healed other people, and that he had this unusual power. And she said he was referred to generally just, he wasn't a doctor, but they called him Dr. John. And she said he didn't take pay, but he had like a donation jar that people would drop money in. And that's basically what happened, really. I kind of tied it to the possibility that it was related to Brother Andre, because at St. Mary's, again, I bring that up, I was a good little Catholic boy, and
Yeah, you sure
I
were.
did something so nice one day that I wanted this special award the nun said she was going to give, so I got the award. And it was just a little tiny leather booklet about maybe 1.5 inches, 2 inches high. It folds open, and it was a piece of cloth that touched the skin of Brother Andre. I kept that all my life, so I knew I needed to know about him, of course. And in this story, then I run into one of my uncles, Arthur Legree, used to take busloads of people to Montreal for all kinds of trips, especially to see Brother Andre and to visit up there. This is a routine thing up north. So it turns out this is around the time Brother Andre died, and he was so famous, famous worldwide. And it seemed like this guy's healing powers kind of came in right around then, and he, I saw.
Maybe he was a surrogate, huh?
Yeah, I saw a connection between the two, but if it helped people, I suppose it didn't hurt anything.
It's very interesting, and we all, as I read this book and talk to you, there are parallels in my own life, although I never lived in Churubusco. But my father was a Methodist minister in Clayton, New York at one point in time, and there was a guy who lived down the street, about 4 houses down. I think he was of Russian extraction, but he was also a healer.
Yeah.
He likewise didn't charge, but had a little box that the people would drop in. And in that little tiny Thousand Islands community of Clayton, on a weekend, my father was trying to get people into church up the street, and there was like 200, like you said, 200 cars lined up down the sidewalk to talk to this guy. And my father, who was deeply religious, of course, a student of the Bible, etc., had to acknowledge to me privately that this guy had something going for him.
Yeah.
And so we talked about it quite often. Very interesting, but though there is a parallel.
Yeah, and to me, it's almost like a sugar pill anyway. Even if it isn't true, if it works.
Well, of course we know that of so many things.
And what would we say?
Is there anything major in this book that we left out that we haven't talked about?
Oh, yes.
I don't want to tell people the whole book. I want them to buy it.
Well, I know as a child, I knew that
Okay. Yeah.
the potato business was huge in Franklin County,
Big.
but it was
Oh.
also huge in Clinton County.
Of course it was.
Much bigger than I knew at the time. And it doesn't slight any of the other farmers in the area to say that the Gagnes led the way, but the Gagnes developed it in the early 1900s, and they went on to develop seed potatoes, and this fed all of Long Island's farms, a lot of Long Island farms. So Churubusco's potatoes fed millions. I mean, it went everywhere. And then another business back in the origins of Churubusco with the Boomhauer and the Humphrey families was they developed a lot of the dairy business, the stores, and then saw an opportunity for the butter and cream. Instead of just, like most farmers did, support your own family, as the trains came in, they realized, we could start selling our butter and cream elsewhere and make a lot of money, and cheese. Cheese became a big product. And the Boomhauers and Humphreys really were the strength of Clinton County's business in that area. I think at one point I showed where if there were 30 or 32 creameries, people from Churubusco were on 10 of them. That's how many. I mean, and that's a very small community. When you consider the Saranac Valley, there's a lot of big farms in this area, Clinton County. So it had it's a great story of Churubusco and Clinton, but it's Clinton County history too. And it's never been really grouped together like this, because I learn it as I do it, and I learned so much more about how important potatoes and cheese and butter were to this area.
I wonder if people who drive through that area, I wonder how people who drive through this area realize that on this corner, over here in this field, and up the street there was a huge wooden structure, a hotel at some point in time, and you dedicate some time to hotels.
Oh.
Alice, when we talked to her, talked about working in a hotel. Her family ran a hotel and
Yeah.
what they did and how she would have.
That's my mom's family, the Legrees.
Of course.
Yeah.
And then of course she talked in her later years of getting on the trains and working down in Utica and coming back home. But hotels, big. You have to mention the hotels when you talk about.
Yes, I wasn't really fond of doing that because it was very difficult to search who took over each one because it's a jumble.
Yeah.
But I did finally figure it out, and it turns out that the famous one that burned and then somebody finally rebuilt, that was the one the Legree family purchased. And that's the one that's there today. It's no longer a hotel, but I did put an ad in there, Legree's Hotel from around the 50s.
Of course, I saw that.
Yeah, and my mom was a Legree. You know, I spent time there myself with my grandfather.
Well, the most important thing that I've learned in this whole discussion with you is that you had a Simon Legree in your in your family.
Yeah, I know more about the Ben Franklin. Oh, and I also included the wind tower story.
Yeah.
You know, just the basics
Well,
of what
yeah,
happened.
of course, we showed the picture on the back, and it's very important
Yeah.
to know that in some ways did revolutionize what happens down there. Certainly, these guys are noticing the difference in their town tax bills, aren't they?
Right, and one thing they probably don't realize is that there used to be windmills up here a long time ago, but they ran
They looked a little different.
a lot shorter.
You know, you have. It would be impossible for us to even delineate how many hours you spent putting this book together. When I talk about your books as being a labor of love, I'm not just flapping my lips, because you have. I mean, I don't know if you ever wrote down. No, I spent 20 hours yesterday and 3 days next week, but you spent.
It took too much time as I tried to do that.
All
Took too much-
over time, did it take you more than a year?
No, because you know the average workday might be 8 hours, but if I can do 20 hours, I can do an awful lot of work inside of 20 hours.
Well, you're an amazing guy. You always tell me you don't need any sleep, but at some point in your life, things are going to come crashing down around you. While we have a few minutes left, Larry Gooley and Bloated Toe Enterprises, have you got a major project underway right now?
Well, as I'm researching the next book that I'm working on, the next two books, I see anything that I like, the bootlegging up here. It's so much beyond what anyone imagines. It's hard for me to grasp it right now. There's so much I'm finding. So I am collecting that, but right now to follow up on the success of Terror in the Adirondacks, because I'm becoming. Really don't sell as many books in Plattsburgh as I do everywhere else.
Yeah.
In Glens Falls and everywhere, we're really popular when we go there. So I'm right now working on one that might include, say, 50 Adirondack stories. Might be a mix of good and evil. Some of the murders and crimes, but not the ones that are known. I don't like to do things that people have done. I like to find something new. So
There are lots.
a lot
There
of
are lots.
some very unusual stories. But I've discovered people like one man just left the area, made his living running a water system for Pittsburgh, I think it was. But the changes he instituted saved thousands of lives from disease. They show how many deaths happened. To me, that's critical. This is a man up here that should be remembered. That, you know, to have saved thousands of lives, literally, when the death toll was 5,000 one year and only 500 a few years later because of him, I think that's important. So, and their stories are interesting. So that's the next book might be something like that, like maybe shorter stories, but 50 of them, but the complete story.
Well, you know, people downstate might think that Albany or the Catskills is upstate, but this is not. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. This is not podunk. We've had people who from this area. You know, you mentioned Minor at the top of the list, but others all the way down through. Many names we've mentioned today, whose legacy is that they actually made a difference.
Yes, that's what I like.
They made a difference.
Right. That's the focus. People that made a difference.
And I would like to think that you would have to admit humbly that doing what you're doing right here with Bloated Toe Enterprises and your own personal projects are making a difference. And I hope history smiles back when they say Larry Gooley did make a difference. It's a good feeling at the end of the day that you have been able to accomplish all those books, and you've helped a lot of other people, and your Bloated Toe store and all the things that you have going. It makes me tired sitting here, and you've been standing the whole time during this interview. Larry, I want to thank you for allowing us to be part of all these things that you do. You're a good friend and a good guy, and you really care about this North Country. And of course, we have to salute your mommy out there somewhere.
Oh, yeah. Don't forget the Queen.
Oh, well,
Queen.
if you think Larry's a good editor, wait till she goes through one of his books and says, "Larry boy."
Yep, she's, I think, 2/3 through the Churubusco book
Oh,
right
she is.
now.
Oh, I can't wait till she
She
finishes.
told me yesterday she's checking closely for mistakes.
Well, again, our personal thanks for all you've done for
Well,
the
thank
North
you.
Country. Best of luck in everything you do. I can't wait till the next chapter of Larry Gooley's Bloated Toe Enterprises life is written. And who knows where we're going to be next time for our little corner.
By requesting a free trial of hydroxyzone today. The results are so impressive. Hydroxyzone was given away in VIP gift bags at International Film Festival. Try hydroxyzone for free and get your parents faster than you thought possible.
She always looks good to me, but now I can't believe how young she looks.
Call now for your free trial of hydroxyzone. For a limited time, try it before you buy it. 1-800-609-3989. But hurry, when this offer's gone, it's gone. Call 1-800-609-3989. 1-800-609-3989.
With more practical tips and useful advice, here's your old Farmer's Almanac radio report for Wednesday, November 24th, the 328th day of the year. The king of ragtime, Scott Joplin, was born on this day. The first of 1,200 guys and dolls performances opened 60 years ago on Broadway. What cousin of the tulip and hyacinth is the most eaten vegetable in the world? The onion.